a little girl disappeared without a trace. Her mother waited, not 1 day, not 1 week, but 31 days before telling anyone she was missing. 3 years later, millions of Americans watched a jury return a verdict that left the nation stunned. To some, justice had failed. To others, the prosecution simply hadn't proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. How could one of the most closely watched murder trials in American history end with a verdict that still divides the country? This is the story of Caylee Anthony, and the verdict millions still can't accept. In the summer of 2008, Orlando, Florida, looked like countless other American cities. Families went about their daily routines, children played in neighborhood parks, schools prepared for another academic year. Nothing suggested that one missing 2-year-old would soon dominate national headlines and become the center of one of the most controversial criminal trials in modern American history. The little girl's name was Caylee Anthony. To friends and relatives, she was described as energetic, playful, and deeply loved by many members of her family. But by the middle of July, something had gone terribly wrong. One detail would come to define the public's perception of the case almost immediately. Caylee was not reported missing the day she disappeared. She wasn't reported missing after a week. She wasn't reported missing after 2 weeks. Instead, authorities learned about her disappearance roughly 31 days later, after concerns within the family escalated and law enforcement became involved. That fact alone became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire investigation. Why had so much time passed? What happened during those weeks? And what, if anything, did investigators miss? Those questions would drive the case for years. When detectives began interviewing Caylee Anthony, they faced a rapidly evolving timeline. According to statements she gave investigators during the early stages of the investigation, Caylee had supposedly been left with a babysitter who could no longer be located. Detectives immediately began checking the information they had been given: addresses, names, phone numbers, employment records, witnesses. But investigators soon discovered that several important claims they were attempting to verify did not hold up under scrutiny. As more interviews were conducted, detectives increasingly focused on reconstructing an accurate timeline of Caylee's disappearance. The investigation quickly shifted from searching for a missing child to determining exactly what had happened during the previous month. News coverage spread rapidly. Television crews gathered outside the Anthony family home. National networks carried daily updates. Experts debated every new development. Across America, people followed each revelation almost in real time. For many viewers, this wasn't simply another criminal investigation. It became an emotional mystery. Everyone seemed to be asking the same question: where is Caylee? As days turned into weeks, hope that she might still be found alive began to fade. Detectives searched neighborhoods. Evidence was collected. Family members were interviewed repeatedly. Every new lead was carefully examined. At the same time, media attention intensified, placing extraordinary public pressure on investigators to find answers. The case was no longer just a local investigation. It had become national news. Millions of Americans were following every update, every press conference, and every rumor. Yet, despite the enormous attention, one crucial question remained unanswered. What had actually happened to Caylee Anthony? The investigation would soon uncover evidence that fueled intense debate across the country. Some believed it pointed clearly toward homicide. Others argued that the evidence left too many unanswered questions. Those competing interpretations would eventually collide inside a packed courtroom, where every piece of evidence would be examined under extraordinary public scrutiny. Months passed with no sign of Caylee. Search teams continued combing wooded areas, fields, and neighborhoods across Central Florida. Volunteers joined law enforcement, hoping against hope that the little girl would be found alive. Then in December 2008, everything changed. A utility worker searching a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony family home noticed what appeared to be human remains. Investigators quickly secured the scene. Forensic specialists carefully documented every piece of evidence before anything was moved. Soon afterward, the remains were identified as Caylee Anthony. The missing person investigation had officially become a homicide investigation. But one heartbreaking discovery raised even more difficult questions than it answered. How had Caylee died? And who was responsible? With no eyewitnesses to the alleged crime and no confession, prosecutors knew they would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. Every forensic clue suddenly became critical. Investigators examined computer records, phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence collected throughout the investigation. One area of intense scrutiny involved Caylee Anthony's online activity. During the weeks before Caylee was reported missing, prosecutors argued that certain internet searches and digital evidence supported their theory that Caylee's death was not an accident. The defense strongly disputed those conclusions, arguing that investigators were drawing inferences that were not supported beyond a reasonable doubt. The battle over digital evidence would become one of the trial's most closely watched issues. Another important piece of evidence centered on Caylee Anthony's vehicle. Witnesses testified about a strong odor coming from the trunk. Investigators conducted forensic examinations and introduced expert testimony regarding what they believed the evidence suggested. Prosecutors argued that the findings supported their theory of the case. Defense attorneys challenged both the scientific interpretation and the conclusions drawn from that evidence, questioning whether it could reliably establish what prosecutors claimed. The same evidence was viewed in dramatically different ways depending on which side was presenting it. That pattern would continue throughout the trial. Investigators also recovered duct tape in the area where Caylee's remains were found. Its significance quickly became a major point of disagreement. The prosecution suggested that the tape was consistent with its theory of homicide. The defense countered that the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exactly how the tape came to be associated with the scene or whether it had any role in Caylee's death. For jurors, this presented a familiar challenge. Was the evidence pointing clearly in one direction, or was there enough uncertainty to prevent a criminal conviction? Unlike many murder investigations, there was no single piece of evidence that appeared to answer every question. Instead, prosecutors assembled what they described as a chain of circumstances. They argued that when each piece was viewed together, it formed a compelling picture. The defense responded with a different argument. They reminded jurors that suspicion alone, even strong suspicion, is not enough to convict someone of murder. Under American law, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That legal standard would become the central issue of the trial, not whether people believed Caylee Anthony had acted suspiciously, not whether investigators had unanswered questions, but whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed the crimes charged. As new details emerged, public opinion intensified. Television commentators debated the evidence nightly. Legal analysts disagreed over its strength. Newspapers ran front-page coverage. Online forums filled with passionate arguments. For many Americans, opinions were forming long before a jury was ever selected. Some believed the evidence overwhelmingly pointed toward guilt. Others urged caution, arguing that emotional reactions should never replace the legal process. The courtroom had not yet heard opening statements, but outside its walls, the debate had already begun. By May 2011, nearly 3 years after Caylee Anthony disappeared, one of the most anticipated criminal trials in America was finally underway. News organizations from across the country descended on Orlando. Every day, television cameras captured long lines outside the courthouse. Legal analysts dissected testimony almost minute by minute. Millions of Americans followed the proceedings, convinced they were about to witness justice for a little girl whose story had captured the nation's heart. But inside the courtroom, emotion alone could not decide the outcome. The jury had one responsibility: to determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors argued that Caylee's death was not an accident. They presented a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, asking jurors to consider how multiple pieces of evidence fit together. They highlighted Caylee Anthony's conduct in the weeks before Caylee was reported missing. They questioned inconsistencies in her statements to investigators. They presented forensic testimony, digital evidence, and witness accounts that they argued supported a deliberate act rather than an unexplained tragedy. Their message was clear. While no single piece of evidence answered every question, prosecutors argued that the totality of the evidence pointed toward guilt. For them, the individual pieces formed one complete picture. The defense offered a dramatically different explanation. Defense attorneys argued that Caylee's death had been a tragic accident inside the family home. They maintained that prosecutors had built a theory rather than proving a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, defense lawyers challenged the reliability of key forensic evidence. They questioned whether investigators had reached conclusions that the available science could not fully support. Again and again, they reminded jurors of one fundamental principle of American criminal law: the burden of proof always rests with the prosecution. If reasonable doubt remained, the law required an acquittal. As the trial continued, expert witnesses became central to the case. Forensic specialists, investigators, and scientific experts took the stand. Some testimony appeared to strengthen the prosecution's theory. Other testimony gave defense attorneys opportunities to challenge how certain evidence had been interpreted. To many people watching from home, the scientific evidence seemed overwhelming. To others, it appeared less definitive after days of cross-examination. That difference in perception would become one of the defining features of the trial. The same evidence often produced two completely different interpretations. For weeks, jurors listened carefully. They reviewed photographs. They examined timelines. They heard emotional testimony from witnesses and technical explanations from forensic experts. Unlike television viewers, they could not discuss the case with friends. They could not conduct independent research. They were instructed to base their decisions solely on the evidence presented in court and the law explained by the judge. Outside the courthouse, public opinion had largely taken shape. Inside the jury room, however, the standard remained unchanged. Not suspicion, not public outrage, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Then came July 5th, 2011. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned. Millions watched live. Families gathered around televisions. Newsrooms paused their regular programming. The clerk began reading the verdict, not guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, not guilty. On the charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child. Caylee Anthony was found guilty only of providing false information to law enforcement during the investigation. The reaction was immediate. Inside the courtroom, emotions were restrained. Outside, shock spread across the country. For many Americans, the verdict was almost impossible to believe. Social media exploded. Television networks interrupted programming. Legal experts debated the outcome for days. One question echoed across the nation: how could a case that seemed so convincing to so many end in acquittal? For many Americans, the verdict wasn't simply surprising. It was unforgettable. Within minutes of the jury's decision, television studios across the country filled with legal analysts attempting to answer one question: how did the jury reach this conclusion? Many people believed the prosecution had presented a compelling case. Others argued that, while the circumstances were deeply troubling, criminal convictions cannot be based on suspicion alone. Those two perspectives continue to define the public debate today. But to understand the verdict, it's important to understand the difference between public opinion and the law. A criminal jury is not asked whether something seems likely. It is asked whether the prosecution has eliminated reasonable doubt. That is one of the highest legal standards in the American justice system. And in this case, the jury concluded that standard had not been met for the most serious charges. One of the lasting legacies of the Caylee Anthony trial is how it forced millions of Americans to confront a difficult legal principle. The courtroom is not a place where jurors decide which story feels more believable. It is where they decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, using the evidence presented at trial. Legal scholars continue to debate the strengths and weaknesses of both sides' arguments. Some believe prosecutors relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence without being able to explain precisely how Caylee died. Others believe the overall evidence was powerful enough to support a conviction. Reasonable people, including experienced lawyers and former judges, have reached different conclusions. That disagreement is one reason this case remains the subject of documentaries, podcasts, books, and legal discussions years later. The Caylee Anthony trial changed more than headlines. It changed how many Americans viewed high-profile criminal cases. It sparked national conversations about media coverage, forensic science, jury decision-making, and the influence of public opinion on the justice system. News organizations devoted months of continuous coverage. Millions followed every development. For many viewers, it was one of the first criminal trials they watched from beginning to end. It became a defining moment in modern true crime media. And even today, mention the words Caylee Anthony, and strong reactions often follow. Cases like this remind us that justice is rarely simple. Evidence can be interpreted differently. Witnesses can be viewed in different ways. Experts may disagree. Jurors carry an enormous responsibility. Their decisions affect lives forever. Whether someone agrees or disagrees with the verdict, the case illustrates an important principle. Our justice system is designed to protect against wrongful convictions by requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt, even in cases that generate intense public emotion. That principle can be difficult to accept, but it remains one of the foundations of criminal law. More than a decade has passed. Questions remain, conversations continue. The memory of Caylee Anthony has never completely faded from the American public consciousness. The trial may be over, the verdict may never change, but the debate surrounding it continues to shape discussions about justice, evidence, and accountability. Perhaps that is why this case still captivates millions of people today. Not because every question has been answered, but because so many people still believe important questions remain. Now, we'd like to hear from you. After hearing the evidence presented during the trial, do you think the prosecution proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Or do you believe the jury reached the correct verdict under the law? Which piece of evidence do you think had the greatest impact on the outcome of the trial? Please keep the discussion respectful in the comments. Thoughtful conversations help everyone better understand these complex cases. If you enjoy carefully researched documentaries that examine America's most controversial criminal cases, you're in the right place. On your screen now are two documentaries you won't want to miss. O.J. Simpson, The Trial That Divided America Forever. Compare two of the most debated verdicts in American legal history and decide for yourself how evidence, media attention, and reasonable doubt shaped each outcome. The cold case that haunted detectives for 40 years. See how modern investigative techniques reopened a mystery that had remained unsolved for decades. Every case has a story. Every verdict leaves questions. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking the video, subscribing to Crime Codex Files, and turning on notifications so you never miss our next investigation.